This is episode 20 of Soundproofist, and my name is Carrie.
And this is Phil.
And we spoke with Walter Alfredo Montano to learn some of the history of noise. Walter is an acoustician and researcher from Argentina, and he's currently based in Peru. He's been digging through newspapers and archives to find stories about the earliest noise complaints and solutions. And he published his first article in Noise News International, which is the official magazine of the INCE. That's an acronym for the International Institute of Noise Control Engineering. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the earliest known complaints about urban noise and how people thought noise impacted human health. We'll also talk about historical solutions and materials they used in their buildings and their machines. And we'll look at some of the organizations that they formed to address noise issues and activities to educate and engage the public. But first, let's get a little background about Walter.
I have to explain something about my background because, first of all, I have my secondary education. It was in Argentina, but in technical high school. I don't know if they're similar in United States, but we learn all the skills in one school. During the day and day hours, we learn like regular high school, but in the afternoon, we learn, in my case, electronics. After that, my intention was to study electroacoustic or acoustic. But back in 1985, there is no acoustic school in Argentina. So I had to make my own education tree and try to learn by myself. But always I have to involve in the hard part of the acoustic, designing, doing measurements, not in the human way of the acoustic. And because of my work, I have to be involved in many social problems due to the noise. One big company, they say, okay, why people complains about noise? Because the limits is, 45 dBs. And people consultants, they measure 40 dBs. So why they are complaining? So this situation was in the middle of Amazonian rainforest. And the problem is, for me, was simple because everybody measure in dBA, not in the whole spectrum. So I have to translate this technical problem into a human language. So in 2012, I came back to my university and I got a degree in social science and historical science. So I realized there the importance to study the history and also the philosophy. So when I was studying, I discovered a new world about history of science and perhaps why I involved for this special project for INCA. I met Marion Burgess in 2018 in Hiroshima Congress, the acoustic for IAAV Congress in Hiroshima. And I shared with her some findings that I made because something that I studied in human science is to look and to seek the original source of the information, not just the secondary information. She was very amazed for my discoveries. She shared some news that I found to EOIN from NNI magazine. And they say, okay, if you want to write some article about what you found, okay, you are free to do. I am here, involved in this special project.
I know you've done a lot of research about the history of anti-noise activism and anti-noise complaints, but can you tell us what you've learned about how people associated noise with health issues in history?
Wow. It is interesting the way of, through the ages or years, the people thought about this problem like problems to human health. I think that the first time that we have to put a reference is perhaps about 1513, no, 91, a German otologist. He said the problems or the deafness is not a problem of the soul. We have to think that the problem is natural. Okay, we are talking about the Renaissance area, 1591, that year. And the second most important thing that he talked about the deafness is about that it's not the same, the congenital deafness to the deafness that one person can acquire because accident or something like that. I think the other was perhaps what think about the deafness, the people deafness, of course, in ancient days said they thought that the deafness belonged only to worker peoples, only workers, not they never talked about the deafness is produced by human noise. The first encyclopedia that analyzed the noise problems at workplace was done for Ramazzini, an Italian doctor. And after that, I don't know, perhaps more than 150 years. Ramazzini wrote the encyclopedia in 1713. And it was until 1830 that for the first time, one physician, he's from England, that wrote in Lancet magazine, like for the first time scientifically, it published one article about deafness in human. But there are 6 or 7 other physicians that they do an important work, but it wasn't until 1895 that one neurologist from Germany that he said the human noise can produce mental illness. And the word, the most famous word was neurasthenia. They say the human noise produces neurasthenia. And after that, we can talk for just this modern concept. But I think that was the first time.
Wow. That's very interesting. It goes all the way back to the 18th century, which I didn't realize.
Yes, but it is important about the timeline of a specific author, because another thing to share in this moment is one French doctor. The question was that the deafness worker, they said, is only belong to boil makers or iron makers or metal artisans. But in 1854, a French doctor, he investigated the deafness on train drivers in 1854. And they also, he and other physicians, they associated the deafness for train drivers as some kind of infection, internal infection, because they observed that the train drivers, they conduct the train, the locomotives, in the middle of the vapor, in the middle of all the smoke. And they say, okay, the deafness is produced by high noise level inside the smoke. And they say, okay, perhaps the deafness in this kind of worker is produced by infection.
Infection. Interesting. So this sort of segues into the history of people talking about noise pollution in cities, not just as a health issue, but noise pollution in general. Have you found that the history of noise in cities is sort of parallel to the history that you're finding about health and noise?
It is interesting that the common people, the general people, they thought that the noise is, or human noise is started perhaps after the Middle Age, when the city grows in manners that no one knows before. Or perhaps the urban noise is because of the mechanical train or the mechanical cars or the industrializing factories inside the cities. But this is not completely true. I found an interesting research that the first time that is written in history, okay, I mean, the first people, the first culture that used writing was the Sumerian. So it is interesting because the one tablets or many tablets written in clay is about 2500 before Christ. It exists writing. The name of that writing is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And they say that a prophecy because one god talked to Gilgamesh about the noise in the city is so high or so annoying that the gods, they want to put an end of that noise. The epic is quoted by, in those days the world changed, the people multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull, and the great god was aroused by the clamor. Enil, the god, heard the clamor, and he said to the gods in council, the uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible for reason of the vapor. So the gods agreed to exterminate the mankind. So the epics recounts how a great storm and flood was brought to the world by the god Enil for the noise and confusion they brought to the world.
I'm thinking they didn't have earplugs back then either.
No, we are talking about 5,000 years ago.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a dire warning, y'all. Everyone at home, keep it down, or we might, the sea level's going to rise if we're too loud. It's very dangerous. The gods will smite us. That's amazing. I never realized that the Epic of Gilgamesh had noise pollution as a central theme. That's amazing.
Yes, I think this is the 11th tablet. They wrote about this kind of problem, that it was interesting because no one realized that. I think, historically speaking, the first ordinance that regulate not only the noise, but also the acoustic sonification, in matter of size, is about 600 before Christ. It was a city, Sybaris, in southern Italy, and they wrote a specific ordinance to keep the workers outside the city, and they proposed acoustic sonification. It's really interesting. The source of this information is not yet. The original investigation is from 1929. I could find the article, but the magazine is in London in one library archive, but no one can access now because of the COVID. So they told me, well, okay, Walter, you have to wait after the COVID supersedes, and we'll send this source, because at the moment, all people talk about this ordinance, but no one knows specifically what it says.
So, what were some of the historic remedies for noise pollution that you've uncovered in your research?
I think one of the first issues that we find is perhaps about year 44 in Rome. They ask of using leather to cover the wheels because the noise produced by the carriage, the wagon, was so high. And they also ask for putting grease in the axles. So I think that perhaps is the first written remedy for noise. During Middle Ages, there are so many mentions about monks and churches. I think that the first people that complain about noise are from religious people, not for the common one, because they say, okay, I need silence in order to the God could hear my thoughts. So they say, okay, I need silence. This thought, this behavior, it was taken for centuries until the 19th century. So in Middle Ages, in the church, the monks or priests, they say they need silence. So for remedies, they order to build walls in the middle of the windows buildings, because they have to block the noise. And perhaps because of that, they have specific names, or because isolated monks, but it was for they have to be isolated from the street noise. And the other measures that they took was to construct a basement, all during the Middle Age. But what I found about, specifically talking about materials, it's around 1835 in one physics books. They analyze the electrical, mechanical, and other properties from different materials. And one materials that was used for, I don't know, a century or more, it was the India rubber, the material that used in cars and everything. But it was, for me, interesting that in 1835, the person, the researcher, the philosopher that do that kind of measurements, but they describe that the India rubber has a low sound transmission, he said. And after that, they use the India rubber to mitigate not just noise, I mean the vibration. And I found, I don't know if it was true, perhaps it was an announcement for one company, that they use India rubber in 1848 to reduce the train vibration. And they use this India rubber. Also, they say the cars was mounted in India rubber springs. And they use it in Stonington Railroad. It was a railroad from New York to Boston through Connecticut. And it is interesting, but I didn't find any news about it was true or not. But it's like today, a company say, okay, I will reduce the noise, but I don't know if this was true. Another interesting things, the materials I found is really amazing, because in 1849, the Labour's Friend Association from London, the architects, they proposed to build special or specific houses for workers. And they said we have to use hollow bricks, because hollow bricks is important to improving the condition to deaden sound.
Hollow?
Hollow bricks.
That seems like it seems like the opposite of what would be effective.
Yes,
that's interesting.
Yes, we have more knowledge, but we are talking about 1849.
Exactly.
The noise spectrum is very different today. And other interesting material that someone proposed, but again, I don't know if it was true or not, but some research, he said the asphalt membrane is useful to deaden sound. And he patented a system to use the asphalt membrane between walls.
Ooh, that was a good idea.
But, yeah.
Wow.
But it's 1865. 1865.
That probably helped.
But I mean, we know with exact how proposed that asphalt membrane, but this is the patent that he used. And the other material proposed in 19th century is the cork. I think the cork and India rubber together was the most important material, because I don't remember now a lot of names in my mind. Writers in Europe, they put cork on the walls, and they said it was important for them because the cork deadens urban sound, the intrusive sound. It was around 1857 I found this mention. But the use of cork like architectural material or engineering material for isolate the noise is from 1872. The Scientific American magazine published a technical article, and they say the use of cork between walls is enough to deaden sound.
And it's still used today between floor and ceiling a lot for impact noise.
Well, this gives me another do-it-yourself soundproofing idea. If I have some friends that make their own wine, so there's a lot of wine corks around. So again, this would be a long and slow process, but to mount a lot of wine corks onto a board or something, and that maybe would be more useful as like a acoustic treatment rather than noise reduction, maybe more as a sound dampening for like a recording studio situation.
Yeah. And yeah, it wouldn't stop noise from coming in, but it might improve the sound quality inside the room.
So my next idea is I'll rip up a floorboard in my apartment and I'll just throw all of the leftover corks in there. And if I drink enough wine and I fill the floor cavity with corks, then I won't hear the Chinese restaurant that's below my apartment.
Yes, because there is an acoustic company in Portugal. They have plantations, ecological plantations in Africa for, I don't know, for 50, 60 years ago. And they made specific cork membranes, bigger ones. And they are using the cork membranes or cork panels, bigger one. But as far as I know, they are using only in Europe because you also said you have to drink 1,000 bottles of wine.
Motivation. So we covered this a little bit, I think. Can you recall a few of the names of some of the early advocates for reducing noise in the cities? People who were activists and advocates in the earlier days to reduce the noise.
Yes, as I was telling you, what I found, I'm really convinced that the first advocates of noise reduction were people involved in religious activities, because silence is important for reflection and their thoughts can be heard by the gods. The second one advocates was from Greece, the philosopher and thinkers of ancient Greece, because they complained that noise or the murmur of the city's these noises, they did not allow him to think properly. Greek philosopher, they had many political influence. There is some Greek poets that wrote about his noise complaint, but they didn't can do anything against noise, so they had to go out the cities, far from the people. The other situation that I believe is after religious people, wealthy people were the ones who advocate against noise, because wealthy people, they have enough time and money, of course, to have a pleasant life, and the noise disturbing them. And since the wealthy people, they become to have a political influence, they advocate against the noise. As I was telling you about 44 before Christ, the Romans, that decision was taken by wealthy people. They say, okay, we don't want the noise around our homes or our villages. And Middle Ages or after Middle Ages, wealthy people were who advocates for the noise. After wealthy people, musicians were advocated. It's a lot of it's some interesting painting from 18th century that one can see an open window with a musician holding his hair and screaming, and it's kind of ironic paintings because in the street they don't paint carriage or wagon, they paint ironically street musicians. It's interesting. So I don't know if musicians advocate for noise because they don't want competition with street musicians.
Do you know the name of this painter or the name of this painting?
I don't remember now because I have a lot of things in my head. It's Howard. It's 1764 or something like that. Howard. There are one or two paintings and many comments about. The other people who advocate for the noise or against the noise, we can find just in the late 19th centuries, because the morality of the Victorian era was really influential because the Victorian era, we already know, it was wealthy people with political influence and the beginning of the human rights. I mean, the human rights for 18th century. No, we are not talking about the human rights in this century of that age. Okay. In the late 1819, there are a lot of group of people. They advocate for noise, against noise, but like isolated group. What I found is wealthy people, such doctors and lawyers, but the only of that people who belong to lodges, because lodges in the end of the 19th century, they have a lot of political power, and it's possible to find out, for example, the creation of one anti-noise group, and in the books of the lodges, the Masonry lodges, they say, we are happy about the creation of the anti-noise group that was done for our brothers. It is interesting. They think, talking about the modern age, I mean, these influential people in the society, they had access to the press and they can publicize their anti-noise campaign. I think the cornerstone this is in 1906 when Miss Rice from New York, she created Society of the Suppression of Unnecessary Noise. But as I wrote in the article that was published in I magazine, I mentioned two another anti-noise group advocates from London. One is from 1906 and it was disappeared very soon. And the other one was created in 1901. Why this is important? That because in 1908, Mrs. Rice from New York, Lord Borden from London, and Theodore Lessing from Germany, they had a special meeting in London in 1901 in order to create an international anti-noise movement, in order to advocate for noise.
Interesting. Now, I think in your research you've also found that there were groups that formed to protest against the anti-noise groups. In other words, they were pro-noise. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes. I'm smiling because last week I finished one article for Spanish Acoustic Society magazine, because before talk about the situation, special and funny situation that took in Barcelona in 1934, I think pro-noise people during 19th century, pro-noise people perhaps were physicians or engineering. They didn't know about deafness, or they didn't know about mental or illness problem due to noise. The paradigmatic situation that I found is from 1878, because it was really important trial against the elevated metropolitan train in New York. Because I don't know, more than 100 physicians and lawyers, they presented a complaint before the jury, the grand jury. But this company, I mean, we are talking about 1878, it was a huge company with a lot of money, and they presented 3 different memorials. They said memorial before the grand jury, that they say, no, the noise is important for the human life. But we are talking about 1878. That time...
Noise is important.
Yeah. and grand jury said, okay, the noise is important for the society because we need the train noise for the people to go through the city. So perhaps we could talk about pro-noise, but we have to put in that area, in that year. Why I talk about this situation? Because there is another, I don't know if it's a legend, if it is true or not, But Edison, he was invited for the train company to make solutions. He couldn't do anything. They did anything. But I found several articles that the quotation of that newspaper, they say, Edison has invented a machine for condensing the noise of the elevated railways of New York, running it down a pipe to the battery, loading it in the sound steamboat, and dumping it near Brattleboro City. As they say, great man, that Edison. The people of that city expect to calm the noise, and perhaps they can sell it for the 4th of July celebration.
That's great.
Yeah. And yes, now after this funny lesson situation, it's October or November 1934 that it was took place in Barcelona and also in Madrid, but it was more strong, the protest in Barcelona, because the authorities, the Catalanian authorities, they published an ordinance to ban the use of horns and to avoid the unnecessary noise, especially produced at night. Otherwise, they were charged to the drivers high economic fines. This thing was replicated by newspapers all around the world, in all languages, in Europe, but also in Australia. We can find this article. Why? Because many cars drivers, bus drivers, and cabs drivers, of course, they activated them at any time, the horns. And they say, why? Because it exists an ordinances, it is banned, it used. But they say, no, I have to use my horn because the traffic law requires to use them, because the horn is to announce and warn pedestrians of the presence of the car. So the chroniclers, they say, all car drivers and all cabs drivers were driving around the square, honking, bam, 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 against and in protest to that ordinance.
Oh, lovely. Sounds like New York. I think you also uncovered some information about a silence week that used to take place, or at least it was planned. Did it actually ever happen, and what was it?
Yes, but as I was telling you about the first advocates against noise were religious people. So during 19th century, it's possible to find religious pamphlets that they suggested a week of silence or day of silence, whatever, but only talking about the thoughts, the religion's situation. But the first to talk about the week of silence was the day of silence. I found in 1916 the first mention of having a specific day to take care about the human health. That was an initiative from Swarthmore College of Philadelphia. In that college, they studied industrial engineering. And they had an initiative that they call Fatigue Elimination Day. And they celebrated this Fatigue Elimination Day every first Monday in December of each year. They designed that day not for work in college, just to discuss the problem or any fatigue, just like that. But an industrial engineer from England, Henry Spooner, the well-known acoustician, a mechanical acoustician, he proposed a silent day in November in 1977 to do this fatigue elimination day in college in England, in all colleges. They took seriously the noise problem, and he proposed to his students in 1951 a special competition to write about different essays about fatigue and noise. Because of that, he realized that the noise is a strong factor of mental fatigue. So he proposed in 1922 to propose a day of silence. According to what I could read, the American industrial engineering they proposed of having a silent date all around the United States, but I don't know if it took place. I didn't find any information about that. But talking about with having of a silent week, yes, it was proposed by Granville Kleiser. He was a Canadian Methodist speaker. And it is interesting because he wrote a letter to the major newspaper, the principal newspaper around the world. The letter I didn't find yet, but I find a pamphlet, an abstract of his letter, and I quote, because he was a religious man, a Methodist, but it is interesting his proposal. I quote, an anti-noise week observed once a year will mean to the community an economic gain in thought, feeling, energy, health, and self-discipline. The elimination of unnecessary noise does not imply dead silence nor inertia, but increased poise and power with which to do more efficient work. An anti-noise crusade is one of the greatest needs of our time. It's amazing. Okay, finally, it was written in June or July of 1927, and I found that many newspapers from London and from Paris, they took the idea and they wrote, perhaps it is important to our authorities to implement a week of silence or silence week.
I think it would be pretty difficult to enforce for a week, depending on how you interpret silence.
Yes, according to what I was reading, I think it was a silent week, but I think it was only for acousticians, physicians, and researchers. It took place in Belgium in 1935. There are a lot of information, but it is interesting that we can find on internet. This was a really silence week back in 1935. And also it's possible to find a picture because it was women march with banners and they say, we want silent week for women.
That was really interesting. Thanks for sharing all of that history. And I'm pretty impressed at all the dates and names that you remember. I also found that painting. It's called The Enraged Musician by Hogarth, William Hogarth, 1741. It was actually an etching and an engraving. And, I think it's important, a lot of the subjects that you discussed in the history of this and how these ideas have evolved over time, like, for example, deafness being an infection. Obviously we know that's not the case now, but understanding that history is really important. And the same thing with noise mitigation, with, the Roman carriages and the wheels, and also the rubber for the trains, and using cork and these things. But I have to say that I'm so happy to learn those little nuggets about the Epic of Gilgamesh and Edison, canning the noise, storing the noise in a battery, and then saving it for the 4th of July, and that painting those are such great little treasures. So thank you for sharing.
I'd like to thank Walter for speaking with us about his research. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I'll put a link on the Soundproofist blog to Walter's most recent article, and I can list some other resources like books that also cover some of the history of noise. Thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something new. See you next time.